The crystal glass on the table was a perfect, silent lie. It promised clarity, elegance, a civilized evening. But in the private dining room of Arya, silence was not civilized. It was a vacuum, waiting for violence to rush in. 3 men in dark, impeccably tailored suits stood like statues against the silk-paneled walls, their presence sucking the very air from the room. They were waiting for their master, and their stillness was more menacing than any shouted threat. Outside that room, Lena moved through the main dining hall, a ghost in a crisp white shirt and a brown apron. She was 23, and the weight of the city rested on her shoulders in the form of late rent and a tuition bill she could only stare at. Here, amidst the low hum of moneyed conversation and the clink of silver on porcelain, she was invisible. A pair of hands. A quiet apology when a fork was dropped. She saw everything. The nervous tick of the banker in booth 4, the barely there tremor in the hand of the socialite lifting a champagne flute, the way a husband's eyes slid away from his wife's when the hostess smiled. She collected these details like stray tips, a currency of observation that paid her nothing but kept her sharp. Her manager, Mr. Davies, intercepted her by the kitchen doors, his face pale and tight. "Table 7, the private room," he whispered, his voice strained. "He's here. Do not speak unless you are spoken to. Do not make eye contact. You are furniture, understand? Living, breathing, moving furniture." Lena nodded, her heart starting a low, anxious drumbeat against her ribs. She knew who he was. The reservation had been made under a corporate name, but the whispers had slithered through the staff all week. Kaito. A name that was never said loudly. A man who bought silence with fear. She pushed through the door with a heavy silver tray, the decanter of the restaurant's most expensive claret breathing ruby light onto her hands. The man at the table didn't look up. Kaito was smaller than the legend suggested, but his stillness was absolute, a singularity that pulled all energy in the room toward him. He wore a charcoal suit that seemed woven from shadow and smoke. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were flat, ancient things. They passed over her without a flicker of recognition, just as Davies had promised. She was furniture. The problem was even furniture could burn. She placed the decanter down, her movements fluid and practiced, designed for invisibility. But the silence that followed was wrong. It was a held breath before a scream. The first crack in the evening's brittle composure was a sound. A low, guttural string of words from Kaito, spoken in a language that slid past Lena's ears with a familiar cadence but was utterly alien to Mr. Davies. The manager, hovering anxiously by the door, flinched as if struck. He offered a weak, placating smile that didn't reach his terrified eyes. "Sir, our finest selection. A 1982 vintage, unparalleled body." He gestured toward the claret, his voice trailing off as Kaito slowly, deliberately, shook his head. The gesture was small, almost lazy, but it carried the finality of a guillotine. Kaito spoke again, his tone lower this time, edged with the friction of impatience. The syllables were short, hard. A demand, not a request. One of his guards stepped forward slightly, his hand disappearing inside his jacket for a half-second before reappearing empty. It was a twitch, a signal of the rising pressure. Mr. Davies began to sweat, a single bead tracing a path down his temple. "Perhaps a different region, sir? Italian? We have an exquisite Barolo," he was guessing, flailing, throwing expensive labels at a problem he couldn't comprehend. He was trying to solve a math equation with poetry. Lena stood frozen by the service station, stacking polished glasses. She was supposed to be furniture, an inanimate object, but her ears were burning. She understood. Not just the words, but the deep, resonant frustration behind them. He wasn't asking for a different grape. He was asking for a different soul entirely. The liquid he wanted wasn't born of sun-drenched vines, but of patient steam and polished grain. It was a drink of ritual, of memory. And every bottle of French wine Davies offered was a profound, escalating insult. Kaito's hand, which had been resting on the table, curled into a fist. The knuckles went white. The expensive crystal water glass next to his hand seemed to tremble. Lena felt a cold dread wash over her. This was how it happened. A small misunderstanding, a cultural blind spot, a moment of disrespect, real or perceived, that festers and then explodes. She could see the sequence of events laid out before her like a blueprint for disaster. The manager's stammering apologies would fail, the fist on the table would come down, and the silent men against the wall would cease to be statues. Aria, with its soft lighting and Michelin stars, would become a cage. The air thickened, growing heavy and metallic, like the taste of blood in the back of her throat. Mr. Davies was about to make his final, fatal mistake. He was reaching for the wine list again, a useless paper shield against a storm of steel. Lena's body moved before her mind could protest. Every instinct screamed at her to remain invisible, to blend into the wallpaper and let the disaster unfold. But the memory of her grandfather's voice, patient and warm as he taught her the phrases, the cadence, the deep respect embedded in the language, pushed her forward. She took one step, then another, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the plush carpet. "Excuse me, Mr. Davies," she said, her voice a low, steady murmur. He turned, his eyes wide with a mix of fury and panic. "What are you doing? Get back." But she wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on the polished floor a few feet in front of the head of the table. She bowed her head slightly, a gesture of deference, so ingrained it was instinct. Then she spoke. The words felt foreign and yet perfectly natural on her tongue, a key turning in a lock she hadn't realized she carried. She spoke in his language, her voice clear and calm, cutting through the suffocating tension. "He does not wish for the drink of the grape," she said simply. "He desires the drink of the rice. A pure one, unfiltered, served warm." The world stopped. The guard's hand froze mid-twitch. Mr. Davies' mouth hung open. And Kaido, the man who was a gravitational force of menace, slowly lifted his eyes and truly looked at her for the first time. The emptiness was gone, replaced by a sharp, calculating intelligence. His gaze was a physical touch, pinning her to the spot. He said nothing for a long moment, simply watching her, assessing her. Then he replied with a question, the words complex and flowing, a river of syntax designed to drown a novice. It was a test. He was asking about regional differences, about polishing ratios, about a specific brewer from a small northern prefecture known only to connoisseurs. It was a question a tourist could never answer. It was a question designed to expose a fraud. Lena's heart hammered against her ribs, but her grandfather's lessons held firm. She answered, her voice never wavering, explaining that the specific brewer he mentioned was unavailable, but that the owner kept a private stock of a comparable quality, a gift from an associate. She described its character, its subtle notes of melon and cedar. She didn't just speak the language. She understood its culture. A long, breathless silence followed. Then Kaido gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The crisis had passed. The fuse was extinguished. But as she met his dark, unreadable eyes, she realized the explosion had simply been averted, replaced by a much more personal and terrifying danger. With a dismissive wave of his hand, Kaido erased Mr. Davies from the room. The manager practically scrambled backward, his face a mask of shock and relief, pulling the heavy door shut behind him with a soft click.
The sound sealed Lena in.
The private dining room was now Kaido's territory, and she was its sole, captive inhabitant, aside from the silent guards who seemed to be part of the architecture. The air, once crackling with imminent violence, now hummed with a different kind of energy, a cold, predatory curiosity. Kaido spoke to her again in his language, the command soft but absolute. "You will serve me." It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact, a reordering of her reality. She was no longer a waitress at Aria. She was his. For this meal. For this night. For however long he decided. She nodded, a knot of ice forming in her stomach. "Yes, sir." She turned to retrieve the bottle she had mentioned, her every movement feeling clumsy and loud under his unwavering gaze. The walk to the owner's private cellar felt like miles. Her hand was shaking as she retrieved the unlabeled ceramic bottle from its dark, cool resting place. This was the point of no return. She had stepped out from the shadows, and the light she now stood in was the interrogating glare of a very dangerous man. When she returned, she performed the ritual of service with a precision born of deep familiarity, warming the ceramic flask and the small cups with practiced grace. She poured the pale, fragrant liquid, the steam rising like a prayer. He watched her hands, her face, her posture. He was reading her, she realized, not just listening to her words. He was assessing her for weaknesses, for strengths, for utility. She served the first cup and stepped back, trying to resume the invisible posture of a server. But it was impossible now. He had seen her. He gestured to the chair opposite him. Another command, silent this time. Her blood ran cold. Staff did not sit. But to refuse was unthinkable. She perched on the edge of the plush velvet chair, her back ramrod straight, feeling like a sparrow seated before a hawk. He took a slow, deliberate sip of the sake, his eyes closing for a moment. When they opened again, they were fixed on her. "Why?" he asked, the single word in his tongue carrying a universe of meaning. Why did she speak his language? Why was she here, serving tables? Why had she interfered? Before she could answer, a commotion erupted outside the door. Loud voices, aggressive and sharp, shattered the room's cloistered peace. One of Kaido's men opened the door a crack, then immediately tried to shut it, his body blocking the entrance. A man with a garish silk shirt and too much jewelry pushed against the door, his face contorted in a sneer. "Don't tell me he's too busy," the man snarled in English. "Ronin wants a word." The name Ronin hung in the air like sour smoke. Lena saw Kaido's expression harden, the calm observation replaced by a flicker of pure ice. The man at the door, Ronin, was all flash and noise, a peacock strutting into a tiger's den. He was a disruption, a test of dominance played out for an audience of underlings. His men, equally loud and dressed in expensive but poorly fitted suits, crowded behind him, trying to peer into the room. They were a different breed from Kaido's silent enforcers. They postured, they boasted with their eyes, they radiated an insecure aggression that was somehow more frightening than the quiet threat of Kaido's men. "Kaido!" Ronin's voice was a bellow, designed to carry, to embarrass. "Don't hide in your little box. Come out and drink with a real player." Kaido's guard at the door, a mountain of a man named Kenji, simply held his ground, his face an impassive mask. He spoke a single, clipped phrase in his native language. It was a simple command to leave. Ronin laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Then he switched languages, spitting a torrent of insults at Kenji. The words were coarse, designed to provoke, but beneath the surface vulgarity, Lena heard something else. A pattern. A coded insult she recognized from old films, from historical novels her grandfather loved. It wasn't just a challenge. It was a specific, formal accusation of cowardice, one that, by ancient tradition, could only be answered in a certain way, by stepping outside, alone, to face the accuser. It was a trap. A beautifully constructed, verbally intricate trap. Ronin was using their own culture as a weapon against them, banking on the fact that Kaido's honor would compel him to accept the duel, to walk straight into an ambush in the restaurant's back alley. Lena's breath caught in her throat. Kenji's hand twitched again, his honor stung. He didn't see the full depth of the snare, only the surface-level insult. He was about to react, to take the bait. All eyes were on Kaido. He sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. But he turned his head slightly, his gaze falling on Lena. It was not a question. It was a demand for intelligence. The fate of the entire room, perhaps of Kaido himself, rested on her. On the invisible waitress. On the girl who was only supposed to be furniture. She had to translate not just the words, but the weapon hidden inside them. Lena leaned forward slightly, her voice barely a whisper, a private channel of sound in a room vibrating with hostility. Speaking in his language, she kept her explanation concise, clinical. He is not just insulting you. He is using an old form. He is invoking a code of honor that demands you meet him outside, alone. His men are positioned in the alley. It is an execution, disguised as a duel. She saw a flicker of something in Kaido's eyes. Not surprise, but confirmation. He had sensed the trap, but she had provided the schematics. She had given him the precise nature of the threat, confirming that this was not a random outburst but a calculated move. Her value had just skyrocketed from a novelty to a vital strategic asset. Kaido's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth, only the cold promise of retribution. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand. He simply gave Kenji a new order, a quiet string of words. Lena watched as the big guard's posture changed. The rigid anger melted away, replaced by a chillingly serene understanding. Kenji nodded once, then turned back to the door. He spoke to Ronin, his voice level and devoid of emotion. Lena didn't need to translate. She could see the effect of the words on Ronin's face. The arrogant sneer faltered, replaced by confusion, then a dawning horror. Kaido had not taken the bait. Instead, he had sent back a message of his own. A countermove. Lena understood the reply perfectly. Kaido, through Kenji, had politely declined the invitation, citing a prior engagement. But he had used a specific, formal phrasing that implied Ronin's business was too insignificant to warrant his attention. Then came the final, brutal twist. He had instructed Kenji to send a bottle of the restaurant's cheapest cooking wine out to Ronin's table, a public and deeply humiliating dismissal. It was an insult so profound it would shatter Ronin's credibility with his own men. He had tried to use tradition as a sword, and Kaido had just used it to publicly brand him a fool. Ronin's face went from pale to crimson. He sputtered, speechless, then spun on his heel and stormed away, his entourage trailing behind him like a pack of chastened dogs. The door clicked shut again, restoring the room's tense silence. The immediate danger was gone, but the reverberations remained. The meal was finished. Kaido stood, adjusting his cuffs. He placed a thick stack of $100 bills on the table, more than enough to buy the entire restaurant's inventory for the night. He looked at Lena. "You are coming with me." The words landed with the soft, heavy finality of a coffin lid closing. There was no room for negotiation. She was no longer an employee of Arya, subject to labor laws and shift schedules. Her brief, accidental display of competence had bought her a new contract, one written in unspoken threat and sealed by his absolute authority. Two of Kaido's men flanked her as she was led out a private rear exit, bypassing the shocked stares of the kitchen staff and the frantic, questioning eyes of Mr. Davies. The cool night air was a shock after the pressurized atmosphere of the restaurant, but it offered no freedom. An armored black sedan idled silently at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the streetlights like shards of obsidian. The door was open for her, and she slid onto the cool leather seats, the scent of expensive cigars and something metallic clinging to the air. Kaido got in beside her, and the door closed with a heavy, vacuum-sealed thud, cutting off the sounds of the city. They were in another world now, a silent, moving vault. As the car pulled away from the curb, a sudden screech of tires and a flash of movement from a side street marked the clumsy, desperate remnants of Ronin's failed ambush. A black van swerved toward them, but Kaido's driver was faster, accelerating with brutal efficiency. There was a sickening crunch of metal on metal as the sedan's reinforced bumper clipped the van, sending it spinning into a row of trash cans. Kenji, in the front seat, grunted, his arm jerking back from the window. He'd been returning fire, Lena realized with a jolt of terror. He turned, his face grim. "Minor," he said in his language, but Lena could see the dark stains spreading on the sleeve of his white shirt, the fabric already glistening. Kaido gestured for the in-car first aid kit. It was a professional-grade medical bag, not a standard roadside box. He tossed it into Lena's lap. "Fix it," he ordered, his voice calm, as if he were asking her to pour more tea. Lena stared at the blood, then at the kit, then at Kenji's pained but stoic face. Her hands began to tremble. This was beyond her. She was a waitress, not a combat medic. But Kaido's gaze was on her, expectant. It wasn't a test of her medical skill. It was a test of her nerve. Taking a shaky breath, she opened the kit. She cut away the ruined fabric of Kenji's shirt with surprising steadiness, revealing a deep gash from shattered glass. The world narrowed to the wound, the antiseptic, the bandages. She worked methodically, her fear transforming into a sharp, focused concentration. She cleaned the injury, applied pressure, and wrapped it tightly, her movements becoming more confident. In the close, suffocating intimacy of the car, with the faint smell of gunpowder and blood in the air, she tended to the wound of a man who, an hour ago, was just a terrifying statue. Kaido watched her the entire time, his silence more intense than any words. He wasn't just seeing a translator anymore. He was seeing someone who didn't panic, who could function in his world of sudden, casual violence. The car ascended into the sky, or so it seemed, climbing the spiraling ramp of a luxury high-rise that pierced the clouds. They came to a stop in a private subterranean garage, and Lena was escorted into a private elevator that opened directly into a penthouse apartment. The space was vast and minimalist, all glass and steel and black leather, with a view that laid the entire city out like a glittering circuit board at their feet. It was beautiful, sterile, and inescapable. She was shown to a guest suite that was larger than her entire apartment. The bed was draped in silk, the bathroom carved from a single piece of marble. A gilded cage. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the river of headlights, feeling more trapped than she ever had in her cramped, run-down walk-up. The next morning, she was allowed a brief, supervised walk to a small park nearby. Kenji, his arm in a clean sling, shadowed her from a discreet distance. It was the illusion of freedom, nothing more. As she sat on a bench, a man in a rumpled trench coat sat at the other end, pretending to read a newspaper. "Lena Roberts," he said, not looking at her. Tough break, getting mixed up with a man like Kaido. Her blood went cold. He flipped a page of his paper. "Detective Walsh. We've been watching him for a long time. We know he's got you. We saw you leave the restaurant." He folded the paper and finally turned to look at her, his eyes weary but sharp. "Here's the situation.
You're an accessory now.
Obstruction, conspiracy. I can make a list of charges that will put you away for a decade. Or," he paused, letting the word hang in the air, "you can help us. You're inside. You hear things. You become our ears." He offered her a deal wrapped in a threat, a classic cop's gambit. He promised witness protection, a new identity, enough money to solve all the problems that had led her to serve tables at Aria in the first place. All she had to do was betray the man who had effectively kidnapped her. "He'll find out," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He'll kill me." Walsh gave a grim smile. "Maybe. But I can guarantee what will happen if you don't help us. You have 24 hours to think about it. There's a burner phone in the trash can behind you. Call me." He stood up and walked away, leaving her alone on the bench with two impossible choices, each leading to a different kind of death. The weight of the city she had carried on her shoulders had just become a concrete block, ready to drag her to the bottom of the river. The dress was his next command. It arrived in a sleek black box, a sheath of deep sapphire silk that felt like water against her skin. It was armor, Kaido had told her, not decoration. Tonight, she would not be a server or a translator. She would be a presence. He was taking her to the opening of a new exhibition at the city's Contemporary Art Museum, a sterile, high-culture environment chosen as neutral ground for a meeting of the city's underworld powers. Ronin would be there. This was not a negotiation. It was a public execution of a different sort. Walking into the gallery on Kaido's arm, Lena felt the eyes of the city's elite slide over her, full of questions. She was an anomaly, an unknown variable at a table of known predators. The air was thick with champagne and quiet menace. She saw Ronin across the sprawling white room, surrounded by his men. He looked diminished, his usual bravado replaced by a brittle anger. He saw her, and his eyes narrowed with a venomous hatred. The meeting took place in a private viewing room, surrounded by jarring, abstract sculptures of twisted metal. The factions sat on opposite sides of a long glass table. Kaido was calm, his voice a low, steady rumble as he laid out his terms. Lena sat beside him, translating his words with cold precision. Ronan, desperate to regain his lost face, tried to bluster and posture. He made a counteroffer, a seemingly generous proposal regarding shipping routes through the southern ports. He phrased it in the flowery, overly polite language of formal business, a stark contrast to his usual vulgarity. But as Lena translated the words for Kaido, she heard it. A faint echo. He used a specific, obscure term for guarantee, the same archaic word he had used in his coded insult at the restaurant. It was a verbal signature. A tell. A trapdoor hidden under a welcome mat. She knew, with chilling certainty, that the guaranteed shipments would be met not by Kaido's partners, but by federal agents. Ronan was trying to save himself by selling Kaido out to the authorities, using the same coded linguistic tricks he'd tried before. A hot wire of adrenaline shot through her. This was her moment. This was the choice Detective Walsh had forced upon her. She could translate the word literally, let Kaido walk into the trap, and save herself. Or she could honor the strange, terrifying allegiance that had been forged in a private dining room over a bottle of sake. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against the silk of her dress. She took a breath. When she translated Ronan's offer to Kaido, she made a single, deliberate change. Instead of translating the loaded word as guarantee, she used a different term, one that meant a gift to the authorities. She changed one word, and in doing so, she re-aimed the weapon. Kaido's eyes did not change, but Lena felt the shift in his stillness. He had understood her instantly. The subtle alteration, the deliberate mistranslation, was a blaring alarm she had sounded in a language only he could hear. He now saw the entire shape of Ronan's desperate, pathetic betrayal laid bare. Ronan, oblivious, leaned back in his chair with a smug look, believing his trap was set. Kaido let the silence stretch, a conductor holding the orchestra at the peak of a crescendo. Then he smiled his cold, razor-thin smile. He spoke, his voice still calm, but now laced with something lethal. He addressed the other faction leaders in the room, ignoring Ronan completely. Lena translated his words, her own voice a clear, steady instrument of his will. Ronan has made a generous offer, Kaido began, his words dripping with irony. He has offered to gift the southern port routes to the authorities. A bold move to clear the field of competition. I wonder who he planned on blaming for such a catastrophic failure. The color drained from Ronan's face. The other men at the table turned to look at him, their expressions shifting from neutral interest to cold fury. They were predators, and they had just smelled the blood of a weak, treacherous member of the pack. Ronan started to stammer, to deny it, but the damage was done. Kaido had used Lena's intel to expose him not just as a traitor to him, but as a liability to everyone. He had publicly signed his own death warrant. The meeting dissolved. Kaido stood, his authority absolute. He had not only survived the trap, but had turned the entire underworld against his rival. As they walked out of the gallery, leaving Ronan to face his new executioners, Kaido's hand rested for a moment on the small of Lena's back. It was not a possessive gesture. It was one of acknowledgement, a silent confirmation of their new, unspoken partnership. The sapphire dress was indeed armor, and her words had been the sharpest sword in the room. Back in the penthouse, the adrenaline of the night slowly receded, leaving behind a profound quiet. Lena stood at the window, watching the city breathe below. The burner phone from Detective Walsh was a cold, heavy weight in her purse, its 24-hour deadline now meaningless. She had made her choice. Kaido came to stand beside her, not speaking, just following her gaze. The reflection in the glass showed them side by side, the silent king and the woman who gave him his most powerful voice. "You are not a waitress anymore," he said, his voice a low murmur in his own language. "You are not a translator," he paused. "You are a strategist." He offered her a choice, but it was not about leaving.
It was about staying.
Not as a captive, but as a counselor and advisor. A permanent fixture in his world of shadow and steel. "Your words have value here," he finished. "More than gold. More than bullets." Lena looked down at the city, a glittering trap of its own. She thought of the sake bottle, the catalyst for this entire mad spiral. It had been a test of culture, of respect. But it had also been a key, unlocking a part of her she never knew existed. She had stepped out of the shadows of her own life only to find herself in the center of his. She was no longer invisible. She was indispensable. And in this world, that was the most dangerous thing of all. Silence had been her shield for so long, a way to survive. But now she understood. Silence was merely the absence of a weapon. Language was the weapon itself, and she was finally, terrifyingly, armed.